On today's episode, I speak to a man that was there at the start of the British music explosion, the uprise of prog rock, and the roar and the snarl of British heavy metal. He was a friend of John Bonham's and Mark Bolan's, and a friend of anybody that likes music. He's a journalist and author. Of course, it's the one and only Chris Welsh.
Welcome to the podcast. If you like us, leave a comment below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel now and make sure you never miss another upload.
It's time to bring you yet another amazing episode.
Chatting Tracks
With Rob, the face for Radio Burgess.
Hi, it's Robbie from Chatting Tracks, and welcome to today's episode. If you've not done it yet, hit that cheeky like button so you can share and spread the love about the show and the podcast. I'd really appreciate it. It definitely helps me out. Sorry to ask you, but if you don't ask, you don't get. So, give it a cheeky like. On today's episode, I've got the fantastic Chris Welsh. This guy's interviewed everybody from Lulu, the Shangri-Las, the Yardbirds, Led Zeppelin, Genesis, Iron Maiden, Queen, the Kinks. And honestly, I could do the list on and on and on. There isn't anybody this man's not spoken to. Chris Welsh is probably the music journalist. He's been on tour with many bands, including Led Zeppelin, and he's written about 40 books. All the links will be available in the description so you can find out more about his books and his website. If you go on there, there's a fantastic picture of him and Keith Moon from The Who, for instance. We had a fantastic chat. I could have spoke to him for absolutely hours. And at the minute, he's in the process of writing an autobiography. So let's hope that comes out soon, because that will be brilliant. Anyway, enough of me waffling. Enjoy the episode.
Chatting Tracks. Let's talk music.
If we can sort of go back, if that's all right, to the start.
Sure.
Pretty much of your musical history. Was your parents into music? Did you live in a musical household or anything?
Yes, my parents were interested in music, and I grew up in Stratford in East London in a flat, and I discovered later, while we were in this crowded flat full of furniture and an old gramophone and lots of old instruments, violins and a piano accordion, and my parents didn't want to play them anymore. It was much later I realised, because they'd actually been bombed out, I think. They had a house full of stuff, and they ended up in this tiny 3-room flat and in Stratford, as I say, and it was all pretty grim. And it was actually during the war. I was born in 1941. So I do remember bits of the war, growing up in an air raid shelter, that sort of thing. And music was very important to my mum and dad. My dad played the piano a bit, very badly, but very loudly, I should say. Yeah. He used to hammer on the piano. My mother played the violin, and my older brother, George, he played violin as well. But because of the war, there was a lot of stress, and somehow they stopped trying to play. But I listened to music a lot, and we only had a radio, and we listened to BBC radio, and the hit record of the day for me later was Teresa Brewer's Music, 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 which I don't know if you remember that. There's put another nickel in the Nickelodeon, and I loved that song, and I used to whistle it. Although I couldn't play the violin or any other instrument, I could whistle very well, very loudly. And growing up in London in the 40s and 50s, the streets were very quiet, and you could whistle while you worked, making a big echoing noise. I'd whistle all the hits, all the favourite hit songs. Yeah.
Did you ever try to play an instrument at all? Did you ever pick one of those violins up and have a go, or was it just not for you?
No, I was very keen on the idea. In fact, when I went to my first school, which was St James's Road School in Stratford, and it was actually the infants class, and the first day they had a percussion band, and the teachers were a bit, I suppose they were under pressure, and they didn't want to choose children to choose a particular instrument, so they threw them all on the floor in a heap in the hall. I remember this. And everybody had to scramble to pick up an instrument. Of course, I wanted the snare drum. There's a big snare drum right in the middle. Dashed to that, and some bully pushed me out of the way and grabbed the snare drum. And I was only about 4 or 5, I suppose. And I ended up with a triangle, which I hated. I've always taken a dislike to triangles ever since. So that was my first instrument, the triangle. Very unsatisfying instrument, man.
I think if you write your autobiography, that should be the title. I've always took a dislike to triangles.
Yeah,
I think
that's a good idea. Yeah. Well, it's very frustrating. Just one note. Ping, that's it.
Yeah. Rock triangle's not really there, is it?
Play drums. Yeah, sorry. Carry on.
No, that's fine. So you dabbled in the triangle, and that's as far as you got. Well, was you sort of interested in writing at this time as well? Was writing always in the ether as a young boy?
Well, yes, writing was very important to me right from the start. And reading, of course. I was very fortunate. My mother encouraged me to read, and I could read before I went to school, which is pretty good. I remember we used to go on the bus. They had trolley buses in Stratford, with adverts inside, and I'd read out the adverts aloud to all the passengers, showing off that I could read. And one of them was, I drink Idris when eyes dry, which was an advert for lemonade. I still remember that. Amazing. So I could read and write very early on, and my mother used to read me lots of books. And also my parents had inherited this, in this great pile of furniture in our 3-room flat, was a sideboard. I opened it one day, I was sitting on the floor, and it was full of books. And I grabbed a book out and started reading it. And it turned out it was The Idiot by Dostoevsky. So I got as far as 1 or 2 chapters and then gave up. But just recently I thought, I remembered this, and I got The Idiot by Dostoevsky in a hardback, a new version. And I actually completed reading it. So after all these years, I actually finished that book.
Did you enjoy it?
I did, actually. Yeah, it's astonishing. Yeah. But I used to love comedy and school books as well. One of the books I read, because we had all these old books my dad had, and a lot of the pages were singed because they'd been rescued from bombed-out libraries when the books got burnt and damaged. And I used to wonder why all the pages had brown edges. It was explaining why they were rescued from a fire. Oh, great. And one of them was called Fifth Form at St. Dominic's, which is all about public school, which was quite funny, really, because I went to, an ordinary working class school, and I was reading about all these posh lads at the public school. One of the things they did was to start their own newspaper, a school newspaper. And I thought, what a great idea. And so I did that myself. But when I got to the primary school, I started my own school newspaper. And I loved the idea of newspapers and writing. So that's where I started.
That's fantastic. And at this point, was sort of your sort of private music collection building? Was you buying records at this time? Did you have money to buy records?
Well, back in, as I say, when I was still very young and living in Stratford, we did have a great big gramophone, and it was an HMV wind-up clockwork gramophone with 2 little doors in the front. You open out, that was the speaker, and the spring wasn't very good. It used to groan, and it sounded like a sort of a cross-channel ferry engine, sort of grinding away. And my brother used to, he was always teasing me, and he said, look, see that little door there? If you open that door, we put a record on. He said, if you open the doors, you'll see a little band inside playing. There's the Lenin. And of course, I opened the doors expecting to see this group playing inside. It was a big wind-up, literally a wind-up, a gramophone wind-up.
That's amazing.
But the first record I played, and I really liked, actually, was pre-war George Formby. Remember George Formby?
I do, yeah.
People have a cult following for George Formby now. One of his biggest fans was, of course, George Harrison, I've discovered later. My first record I really listened to was called, it was an instrumental. It's called Swing It George, and he was playing Tiger Rag. He wasn't singing, playing this incredible ukulele solo to Tiger Rag, a very fast jazz tune. And I always thought later he was the Jimi Hendrix of the ukulele.
I love that. What I didn't realise about George, I watched a programme on him recently, was how filthy he was. Some of his lyrics were really filthy. They were sort of, little bit of, was it little bit of Brighton rock and all this sort of stuff?
Oh, yeah. Funny enough, I thought you meant George Harrison then. No. Yeah, George Formby's lyrics were very filthy, that's true. Yeah. Raucous, I think they were, for the times. It's very funny, yeah.
Did he ever get banned? Did he get banned for that? Yeah.
From radio, I think he was. Yeah, I think they wouldn't play some of his more raucous numbers. Well, he's a great entertainer, really. Very out of date now, of course, when you see the movies that he was in. But I just love the sound of this jazz music. That's the first time I heard it, with the trombone player playing Tiger Rag. And so I started listening to jazz. And by the way, we moved from Stratford to Catford. We went up market into a house. We actually had a house, and we took the gramophone with us. And my brother said, this is terrible, this gramophone. It clanked one day and it stopped working. So we actually got an electric turntable, plugged it into the wireless, and we could play proper records. LPs and EPs were coming in. So yeah, and my brother was a big jazz fan. He loved Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and I listened to all of that.
I mean, jazz is an interesting format to listen to, isn't it? Like, as you're saying, when you were younger, there was a lot of it around. There's less so now. And I think a lot of musicians were really influenced by jazz, even the Beatles to a degree. I think a lot of them were really influenced, but sort of subconsciously influenced by it with the time changes and the movement. It's just a shame there's not enough jazz around today, really.
Yes, that's true. Yes, jazz was a big part of life in the 50s and 60s for young people. I remember we were all teenagers when I discovered jazz properly. And it was the cool music. The first mods, actually, were modern jazz fans. That's where the phrase came from. And the whole kind of took the phrase mod, well, because the mods changed and when they discovered rhythm and blues and rock and roll music. So, but originally, you were to be a modern jazz fan and you'd be listening to Jerry Mulligan or Dave Brubeck. They were the mods.
Yeah. It's amazing because when you look at a lot of, like me looking back on documentaries now, a lot of them are ex jazz clubs that these early bands started in, like the Beatles and the Who, and they're always, we started in this club, but we weren't allowed to play because we were rock.
That's
like,
true.
I think the Cavern, the Cavern was a jazz club, wasn't it, and all that sort of stuff. And it's amazing that they had to go.
Yeah, the Beatles were a bit hostile to jazz, weren't they? Or trad jazz, because they thought they were being not allowed to play in the Cavern, or they had to fight for space, I think, to supersede the trad bands that played there regularly. So John Lennon in particular, I don't think he liked trad jazz. Oh, shall I tell you about my Skiffle experience?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, that was the next big thing, listening to the radio. People criticised the BBC a lot, saying they didn't encourage music. Actually, they did. They were very good playing the latest music. For teenagers, as they called it, when you got home from school, there was a programme that you could hear, and I turned it on immediately. I think it was on the light programme. Got back from school one day and I heard this incredible record. It was Rock Island Line by Lonnie Donegan. I never heard anything like it. This kind of a narrative blues song with a really exciting climax, and the whole thing just blew me away. And when I went to school the next day, everybody was talking about this extraordinary record they'd heard on the radio. And of course, we discovered it was called Skiffle. And although Lonnie didn't invent Skiffle, he really discovered it. And he was the first revivalist. So he introduced thousands, maybe millions of British young kids to that kind of music. We discovered the blues and all the other genres of music. Thanks to Lonnie, I have to say it was Lonnie. And of course, when we discovered that you could play this music yourself, and all you needed was a washboard, T-chest bass and some acoustic guitars, and within days there were groups being formed, and my mates formed a group, and we called ourselves the Catford Skiffle Kings. That was our name. And I was back to square one because I didn't play the triangle this time, but I had to play the washboard, which was even, a bit better, a bit of an improvement on the triangle. And my mum gave me all these she still had a washboard, you see. That's what was used to dry the clothes with, really. Scrub them, that's right. So she gave me all this collection of thimbles, and you could scrub the washboard and get a percussive sound. So it's like a drum, really.
What I love about Skiffle is, obviously, a lot of bands, yet again, we're going back to the Beatles, sorry, they started out as a Skiffle band, and then, many years later, you get someone like Mumford and Sons that come out and do the same thing, and they brand them as revolutionary.
Yes, I was surprised at that. It's all been done about 50 years ago. Yeah, 50 or longer.
Well, I didn't think it would work, 60 years later. Then all of a sudden everybody's all over it. And it's but you didn't get the revolution again of people picking up the same sort of instruments, did you?
Showed you how good it was, or what an impression it made. Because it was, in so many ways, Skiffle was very important, whether the music was brilliant or not. It was encourage everybody to want to play an instrument and listen to music. And my friends at school, we couldn't afford a guitar, and actually made them in woodwork class. Can you imagine making guitars, their own guitar? And this T-chest bass, where you had literally you could get a T-chest in those days. That's where they stored the tea in your local shop, loose tea. And you stuck a broom handle in it and tied a piece of rope or string into the box, and you could hammer away on the string and change the note by moving the broom handle. And I had to carry this thing. That was another drawback of being in a Skiffle group. You had to carry all the gear. Walking down the street with a washboard and a T-chest bass. I was much embarrassed.
You should have done the harmonica. It would be a lot easier.
Yeah, that's right. I did get a harmonica later. Yeah.
So is it right? You got your first sort of writing job at 16 after seeing Louis Armstrong. Is that right?
Well, yeah. How it worked out was, by the time I went to secondary school, I was editing the school magazine and a classroom magazine. So I was doing a weekly and a yearly magazine, and I was known for writing, which was great. I got a prize for writing, presented by Field Marshal Montgomery.
Wow.
The school prize giving. So I won first for that, and I loved writing. And when I was about to leave school, you had to go to the Employment Bureau, careers advice. That's what it was. And they said, well, what do you want to do when you leave school? I didn't do particularly well. I only got English stuff, few other A-levels, O-levels. And I said, well, I want to be a reporter. I'd like to be a Fleet Street reporter. And they said, oh, they laughed. And they gave me a leaflet on what to do, the job I should go for. And it was mastic asphalt lathe operative. The hell was that? And I realised it meant laying tarmac on the streets, going around laying hot tar. So, well, thank you very much. Well, my dad was outraged, and he actually looked in the classified ads and found there was a job going for a Fleet Street editorial assistant. And I was only 16, and I joined the Scotsman newspaper in Fleet Street. And that was an incredible job, really. I don't know whether I appreciated it fully at the time, because I wanted to be a reporter, and I thought I was getting the tea and doing all the odd jobs in the office. But one day they said, oh, you can, because they knew I was always sitting at the typewriter writing stuff. They said, oh, you can go and review this show. There's a show on in Kilburn, going on, and it's Louis Armstrong's All Stars. I went and I wrote a piece, and they published it. So that's my first piece in a newspaper.
Was it, being at that gig, was that the sort of light bulb moment for you where you thought, like, music journalism is the way forward for me, or were you just covering something? No,
it was a light bulb moment. Yeah, I was very proud and pleased. I didn't get the byline, it just appeared. Louis Armstrong, the Gaumont. And I often used to wonder what the Scottish readers up in Edinburgh or Glasgow would make of it. Now that 16-year-old office boy was pontificating away about the importance of Louis Armstrong. But it gave me a taste for it, and they're very encouraging. And I worked there for 3 years, and Fleet Street then was just so exciting. And I went to every aspect of it. You'd go every day, you'd go into all the national offices, pick up copy and photographs and deliver stuff. So I knew the inside of the Daily Express, Daily Mail, and the Mirror, the Times, and they're all different. And the Evening News had about 7 editions a day, and you'd have to go in and get the front page before anybody else, rip it off the hot press, hot metal. And I remember once the Evening News was so intense, and it's on the top floor, the print room, and I went up there to get the front page, the latest one, which would be wet off the stone. And there were these two guys fighting. They were rolling around on the floor fighting each other. And it was the sub-editor and one of the printers. And you weren't allowed to touch the stone. Union rules. And if you dared touch it, you'd be in trouble. And they're actually punching each other, rolling on the floor. When I arrived, it's very scary. Yeah, that was a great experience. I loved it. And it gave me an encouraging, to want to be a reporter.
Yeah, it does sound like an amazing training ground. I think nowadays, a lot of people, like, you had that experience. People don't have that anymore, because people sit at home on the computer. They don't have that experience where you're mingling with people, you're learning as you go, you make mistakes and you learn. There seems to be no room for error anymore, and I think that's a real shame that this stuff isn't around.
Absolutely true. Yes, the newspaper industry then was king. Everybody read newspapers, and there were dozens of them, and it was great training for me. And of course, I experienced going to the House of Commons and operating the switchboard. I remember the switchboard got into chaos one day. I was answering all the phone calls, and this voice was shouting at me. He said, I want to speak to the editor. And I was trying to plug him in. It's a PBX old-fashioned switchboard. And I said, yes, sir, what's your name? He said, Lord Boothby. He said, oh, I'm sorry. And I had to take copy over the phone, headphones on, and type all the sports reports. And one of them was golf from, I think it's Southampton or somewhere down on the coast. And there's the chief Scotsman golf correspondent was reading out his report to me, which I had to type. And he kept saying, Birdie. What? I had to ask him that 5 or 6 times. What's he saying? And of course, birdie is a golfing expression, which I had no idea how to spell it or what he meant. Wasn't too happy with me.
And then, was it from there you went to the Kentish Times?
Yes, that's right. Because there were about 6 of us young office assistants. Editorial assistants was our title. which meant running back across Fleet Street with a filthy jug of tea, which nobody had cleaned, and you had to give it to all the reporters. So you got to know all the reporters. And all the kids on my, at that time, were all about 16, 17, and they all ended up in the press. One of my friends, Ted, actually, and I met him years and years later. I said, how did you get on? He said, oh, I was the sports editor of the Daily Mirror. So that was a good start. And he just retired. So.
Oh, fantastic.
But I started writing off for jobs on local papers. The first one I had was from Scotland. It was in Arbroath, or somewhere. Oban, out in the wilds. And I discovered it meant commuting from London to Scotland, which I didn't fancy. They offered me a job, and the Oban Times, but I turned it down. And then eventually I got a job on the Bexley Heath Observer, which was part of the Kentish Times series, and that was great. I worked there for 3 years, and
that's wonderful.
That was a really good experience because you got used to interviewing people. I remember shall I tell you what it was like?
Please do.
Yeah, sure. Well, the first day we had the lovely office in Bexley Heath. In those days, the local press had a big readership and covered the whole of southeast London and Kent. It's our group from Woolwich to Dartford, I think, Orpington to Eltham. And we covered everything that happened. So you get to know more about that area of the town and the people than anybody who actually lived there. Like I knew the mayor of all the towns. I'd go to the fire station, the police, the hospitals, the mental hospital, courts, coroner's courts. I used to cover inquests, and that was pretty shocking, actually. Going to, because nobody bothers to do that. I would discover terrible things. Shall I tell you about inquest writing?
I'm interested now, yeah.
But I discovered one thing you should never do is have a chip pan fryer in your home. People used to make their own chips in boiling hot fat, and it caused endless fires. And you go to the fire station, anything to report? Yes, chip pan fire, house burnt down, housewife burnt, and there'd be some dreadful thing until they banned it, I think, or discouraged it. Yeah, it was great fun being on a local paper. But the other interesting aspect, apart from all that, going to the courts and the big crime wave in Bexley Heath was when there was a bank robbery. And it was right next door to our office. But all the staff had chosen to go to the pub for lunch. We're all sitting in the pub. I have to tell you, the reason we were in the pub was it had a great jukebox, and one of the records that was playing on the jukebox I'd never heard before, and it was Love Me Do by the Beatles. First time I ever heard it. And I thought, what an amazing record. We all loved it. And that was the start of Beatlemania. But at the same time, while we were all out of the office, our secretary came running in and said, where are you? Where have you been? All the national newspapers are ringing up. They want a story. There's been a bank robbery next door. And the bank was literally next to our office. Armed robbery. We'd missed the whole thing. We were listening to the Beatles.
Well, what a way to go. Funny, I'm talking of the chip pan thing. I remember as a kid in the 80s, they still had the adverts for those.
Yeah. My mum had a chip pan, and they were dangerous, full of boiling fat. If they tipped over and fell on the gas, then there's a whole lot of go up, set fire to the ceiling. And of course, people tried to put them out in the water and sort of a damp cloth. And that was a regular occurrence. The other terrible thing about inquests was the roads were appalling. There was a road called the A2, which is still there. It's now a motorway. But it was a 3-lane road, and in the middle was an overtaking lane that worked both ways. So that's a recipe for total disaster. At night in fog, you'd find another car coming straight towards you, combined speed of about 60 or 70 miles an hour. Head on.
Crazy. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it was an amazing journey. And then when you was at the Kentish Times, you interviewed the Rolling Stones. Is that right as well? Yes.
Well, the Rolling Stones were our local band. They suddenly emerged. This is about 61, 62, that period. And the whole R&B scene was taking off. And I loved R&B. I went out and bought Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley LPs and listened to all the bands. And the Stones I went to see playing at Greenwich Town Hall. And, of course, they had a lot of aggro with the audience, or the Teds, or the Teddy Boys, as we used to still call them. Didn't like Mick Jagger, and they were shouting, "Oi, get your ear cut." And Mick said, "What?" look like you, which I thought was rather good. But I did write about them. I did a big piece on them, but I didn't actually interview them for some reason. I don't know how I failed to interview Mick and Keith. But yeah, I did a piece on this great new band, local band. I think they're already out on the road and it's difficult to get to them from a local newspaper point of view. So, and then people said to me, well, you're writing about Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and Rolling Stones. You should get a job on a music paper. This friend told me this. And so, yeah, I've been here for 3 years, and how many more bring and buy sales can you write about? Or pub charity nights. Great though they were. I mean, one thing about being on a local newspaper is you never had to buy a meal. Every night there would be a dinner that you had to go. Rugby club dinner, Rotary club dinner. And I'd cover like everything from the Conservative Party functions to the Communist Party. So I'd hear both sides of the story. Yeah.
What I found interesting was obviously Beatlemania is obviously around. The Rolling Stones have just appeared as well, and you're then the first sort of wave of music journalists.
Yeah.
And it's like everybody's finding their way at the same time, which has now left such an impact. Now, you know, looking back to it, then was it one of those things where you realised you were breaking ground, or was it just sort of another thing that was happening?
Well, the extraordinary thing was, in the wake of the Beatles and Stones' success, the whole British music scene took off and people had to write about that. And when I went to Melody Maker, I found, I wrote to Melody Maker. Actually, I wrote to the NME first. They didn't have a vacancy, but Melody Maker did. And I realised that the staff on these music papers, all quite middle-aged and, they seem old to us, but probably in their late 30s, 40s and 50s. And they'd been writing about the music scene since way back. On Melody Maker, we had staff who'd been there before the war. One of our reporters, Chris Hayes, he'd been writing about British dance bands in the 1930s, which was fantastic, but not very suitable for writing about Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames or the Animals. So they needed a new young reporter. And as I said, there was a vacancy, and I went up to, I was offered an interview, and I went up to Fleet Street. And the nice thing was that Melody Maker's office was in Fleet Street, right opposite the building where I used to work from in the Scotsman, 163 Fleet Street. So I was literally crossing the road. And instead of getting the tea, I was now writing the headline stories, the main stories. But they gave me a test, first of all, because I sent them cuttings of my stuff about the Stones and Bo Diddley. And, Gene Vincent lived in Welling as well, so I wrote about him. Didn't interview him, but I wrote about him. So I had this kind of introduction through press cuttings, and the editor then was Jack Hutton, and Ray Coleman was the news editor. And they said, right, okay, yeah, we like what you've done, and you've written lots of letters. I used to write to Mailbag, and they liked my letters, really, complaining about things. Angry of Catford, LP winner. I used to win LPs for writing letters. So they knew who I was, and they said, right, okay, well, we'll give you a test. There's a drummer, famous drummer in London, playing with Dave Brubeck. His name's Joe Morello, and nobody knows what to ask a drummer. We don't have any drummers on the staff. I hear you play the drums, so could you interview Joe Morello? So, yeah, great, okay. Who had to be one of my heroes, a brilliant drummer, of course. So they sent me off on a Sunday night to a hotel in the West End, and I was a bit nervous, and Joe Morello was really charming and very helpful, gave me a good interview, and I wrote it up the next morning, delivered it to the paper, and they printed it the following Wednesday with a big byline. And the headline was a quote from Joe, and he said to me, "You don't have to be an idiot to play the drums, you know." Because drummers do have jazz drummers, they all thought they were sort of lunatics or crazy men.
Yeah.
You know, that's a public image. And Joe was a very studious drummer, of course, with his glasses. So that was the headline, and they printed it with a byline, and that got me the job. So thank you, Joe Morello.
It's amazing. I mean, jazz yet again as well is another incendiary world like rock and roll, where you had people like Phil Seaman that was quite heavily into drugs at the time, wasn't he, and all that sort of stuff. So it was the prerequisite to rock and roll.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, all the drummers were the best. The British drummers were great. There were loads of great drummers. Phil Seaman I used to go and see and interviewed later. And Ronnie Verrill with Ted Heath. who later became famous in the Muppets. I think he was playing with Buddy Rich, remember that? So we had some great drummers, and of course they were technically brilliant, and they also taught a lot. And a lot of the young British rock drummers had lessons. They all went for lessons. And of course, a lot of the guys that were giving lessons were jazz drummers. So there was a sort of mutual respect between them. And although the people like Mitch Mitchell, for example, went for lessons, and with Jim Marshall, who was a singer and jazz drummer, and before building all those noisy amplifiers. So most of the jump, of course, later on when I got a job with Melody Maker, I would love to write about all the drummers in the band. So they're all my heroes. Ringo I didn't interview, but I liked his drumming, actually. People were rather disparaging about Ringo, but he was a great drummer. They always took him at old session men played on the records. Well, maybe they did on one or two, but he was playing there for sure, yeah.
I used to play drums in a band.
Did you?
And
great, fantastic.
Yeah, we used to have the same row with my friends, and it was like Ringo knew when not to play. That's the secret to Ringo's style. He knew when not to play. He didn't fill it up. He didn't fill the song up with drum solos, and he only did one, and that was on Abbey Road. So he was
he did a great ending to Twist and Shout. Do you remember right at the last few bars of Twist and Shout ends with a drum accent or two? Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
But he was just, it's just different when you look at drummers, how different they all are and how unique they all are. I think you say you're a big fan of drummers. I think they must have been a huge fan of you because you noticed them, because generally they're just at the back.
Yes, people say that. But whenever I used to go to a gig, the first person I looked at was, if they got a good drummer, it's going to be a good band because they make the band. Including the Shadows. They had great drummers, Tony Meehan, Brian Bennett, and the Hollies had Bobby Elliott. Fantastic drummers, and I didn't concentrate on writing them. I was doing all the other stuff, pop stuff as well. But I was thrown in at the deep end with Melody Maker because I then had to resign. I was indentured. That's another great thing about local journalism. It's like an apprenticeship. You're actually indentured. I had to go and see the editor-in-chief, and he was very upset that I was leaving because I'd been writing all this stuff for the paper. And, after 3 years of training, they didn't want to lose me, but I couldn't turn it. They realised this was an offer I couldn't turn down.
It must have been an exciting time to be there, just with all this stuff going on. Then music's now, because were they sort of in the press? Was music sort of just the sort of sideline part? Were people actually interested until you got your Melody Makers and ME and stuff like that?
Yes, I think the nationals weren't covering so much. Well, obviously with the Beatles becoming an international phenomenon, then they had to write about pop music in a much more detailed way, and the nationals started to get their own reporters. Don, I can't remember his name now. Don on the Daily Mirror. He was quite famous, So the Nationals started to realise that they had to. The Daily Mirror, to be fair, was always supportive of rock and roll. They covered that a lot. They brought Bill Haley to the country and sponsored his trip over here, I think, back in the 50s. But no, on the music press, the thing to remember about the music press, it was very competitive. When I joined them, the first day, it was a nightmare. The editor, Ray Coleman, he took no prisoners, and he'd been raised in the provincial press. Very tough editor. He had to be, really, to get the paper out. We had, you think it's a weekly paper, and the deadline was Wednesday. And you came in on a Monday, and you had to have all the news and stories written, but at least by Wednesday. So, there's a bit of a tall order. My first day, I was used to life on the local paper, being all very jolly and friendly, sitting in the pub for lunch. Melody Maker, my first day, I had to do all the news stories, and he said, I want you to get John Lennon. Phone him now. Well, where is he? He's at Heathrow Airport. Oh, how do I get him? We phoned the press office at Heathrow and put out a pager message. John Lennon to report immediately to the press office, and then the grumpy John Lennon, what do you want? How does it feel to be number one in the charts? Oh, great, fantastic, man. And then he'd rush off and catch the plane to New York or wherever he was going. So you had to do all this, and the editor's breathing over your shoulder, and you've got to type the stories. Not long stories, but get those news stories out quick. And interviews. One of my first interviews was with the Animals and Ray Coleman, who was very combative. He liked stirring up trouble. It's like a, what would you call it? It's like tabloid journalism. That's it. There's got to be an angle to the story. It can't just be my new album is. It's got to be I hate the bass player. You know, that kind of
Yeah.
purely
Have an angle.
dissent and rouse. And he said the Animals have just gone to the States after the Stones and the Beatles, and I hear they're a flop. He said, you've got to ring Eric Burden and ask him. Oh no, it's Chaz Chandler. So I rang Chaz, and I'd met him before, actually. He's a nice guy, really helpful and funny. I said, I hear the Animals have been a bit of a flop in America. Who told you that? Don't be soft, he said. So I got an earful from Chaz, daring to suggest the Animals were a disaster area in America, which wasn't true, actually. They were doing quite well. Because they had number one, didn't they?
It's just that incendiary journalism, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, throw a bomb in the band and then let's see what happens.
So you had to get a tabloid Sun-style headline: Animals flop shock horror, denied by Chaz Chandler. So this feud thing, it was like developing a feud, which the Nationals still do to this day. They always develop big feuds. One of the feuds I had to develop was Tom Jones and PJ Proby.
Right.
PJ versus TJ. Yeah, PJ would say, Tom Jones, he can't sing. I'm like Elvis, I can sing like Elvis. You get the quote, and then Tom Jones, well, I don't know, he's quite a good singer, but set them up. It's very fun.
Are we okay just to throw out some names of the people you spoke to? Is that okay? Just to give people an idea.
Sure, yeah. I was just going to say, in that first week, one of the people, like bands I interviewed was, I'll show you. Well, the Beach Boys, of course. The first week I was on the paper. I did the Beach Boys, the Animals. I've got cousins. Oh, the Shangri-Las. Do you remember the Shangri-Las? Remember Walking the Sound. The Rocking Berries, Charlie Watts, Helmut Zacharias, the violin player, and the Yardbirds with Eric Clapton. So that was my first 2 weeks on the MM.
That is crazy. And you spoke to Lulu, Sandy Shaw, Nancy Sinatra, is that right? Paul Simon, PJ Proby, the Animals, the Who, the Small Faces, the Hollies, the Bee Gees, the Moody Blues, Cream. Like all these. Oh wow! I mean, what a list of people to speak to.
It was extraordinary, because being a weekly, the whole music business was taking off like an explosion, and it was all geared to the chart. Of course, if you had a hit, you had to be written about, and that helped a lot. Nothing wrong with being in the chart. Although, funnily enough, the Yardbirds, when I interviewed them in the coffee bar, it's when I met Eric for the first time, and he was sort of smiling at me and grinning, because all the other guys were going crazy. They thought, why aren't we in a pub? They were demanding kingship. And Eric was looking at me just to say, I'm not with these guys. And I realised that even then, this is right early on, he was thinking about leaving, which he did later, of course.
Wow. Did they, were they sort of, when you went into these interviews, was there a sort of, I know you sort of had to do the journalist angle as well, like you were saying a bit with the thingy, but was it pretty much, all the same? Was everyone pretty much down to earth? Was there anyone that was just too wild for you to speak to that you thought, I don't want to get involved in this person or this band? Or
Well, no, not in the early days. Everybody wanted to be in the music press. It was a very prestigious thing, and their publicists and managers were desperate to get them in the paper, and they were fighting for coverage. So it was very important to be in the NME or Record Mirror or Disc or Music Echo, or No Sounds then, that didn't exist, or Melody Maker. And the big battle was between Melody Maker and the NME. We wanted to get the stories first, and as I say, you had to get a bit of an angle on whoever's in the chart. It would be a bit boring otherwise to read, so you wanted to make it readable. But the artists themselves, generally speaking, were all very helpful and cooperative. Sometimes they were a bit suspicious, or they weren't sure quite how to take you. I remember some of the bands, the Rocking Berries and Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders. Some of the bands were a little suspicious. Usually the ones from Birmingham, I have to say. Bands from up north are a bit suspicious of us Southern Jessies asking about their music. But I'll tell you who was really good. The Moody Blues. They were quite tough guys from Birmingham. And I got on really well with Denny Lane. He was terrific. And I think there was a guy called Clint Warwick and a because they were long in tooth. Another thing about bands then was that often they were much older than they pretended to be. Lied about their age. And you discover like the bass player might be in his 30s, really, claiming to be 22. And they'd been working in factories, so they were quite down-to-earth guys. But once you got past that little barrier, get on really well. And I was invited to a recording session with the Moody Blues, and had Go Now, of course.
Wow,
And, I went to the Moody Blues recording session, and I forget the name of the producer now, a very famous producer. But the band said, "Oh, you play the drums. How about you playing, what was it they wanted me to play? I think it was the tambourine or something. Keep time."
Yeah.
And I had to keep time with the band. And the producer was shouting, "Get him out of the studio. He's speeding up."
I thought he was going to say the triangle.
So that was my first attempt at recording in the studio with the Moody Blues.
When you were sort of talking to this amazing roster of artists, how did you go in as a journalist? Did you have set questions, or were you sort of just going along and see how the conversation went, or did you have a set 10 questions in your mind that you would always follow for each person?
Well, I usually had, I'd usually get some guidance in the editor, what kind of angle they want. But generally speaking, I seemed to understand that, and I could do it myself. And I knew that the bands that I was talking to, and being Melody Maker, which was more of a musician's paper, if I talked to them about their techniques and their ambitions and their attitude to music and their influences, that's what I talked to them about. And then you establish a rapport. Like if you were speaking to Eric, you didn't say, "What's it like having screaming girls chasing you?" You'd ask him about his blues guitar influences, and they'd appreciate that, because a lot of the papers didn't. Some of them were real pop papers like Rave or Bunty, girls' papers. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It was great, and they'd be on the front cover. Like the Small Faces were on the cover of the pin-up magazines all the time. And they would be tending to ask questions like, "What did you have for breakfast?" And "What do you think of the latest fashions?" And yes, all of that. So gossip, really. So if I was asking questions about asking the bass player what strings he had, he'd be delighted to tell me. Very few people on Bunty or Rave would be interested in that kind of technical stuff.
So obviously you were still there in the 70s, and prog rock comes in, and you spoke to like Led Zeppelin, Genesis, and ELP and people like that. Prog rock, when it came in, from a journalist point of view, was it accepted quite well, or was it one of those things where people were like, "That's just too much because it's too in depth for the audience"? It wasn't a 3-minute single. Were people enjoying that, or was it too much for them at the time?
Yes, there was that attitude, but remember that it was coincided with the age of the album. The LP came. Up to then, LPs had been mainly collections of hits, chart-busting hit collections, which was great. Like, even the Beatles did that, I think. But the Beatles had suddenly stopped, and they showed the way that you could improvise. Obviously, Strawberry Fields Forever and all those wonderful records they were making. And Cream were a big influence, because they showed that rock musicians weren't four-chord guitar merchants, or 3-chord, sorry. They're only allowed 3 chords. And that the drummers could play, and that there were all these young, brilliant musicians. We were talking about earlier, the drummers in particular, people like Mitch Mitchell, Ginger Baker, who I got to know very well. Yeah. Shall I tell you when I first went to see Cream rehearsing? Or
yes, please.
Are we jumping back a bit?
No, it's great. It's great.
Yeah, I got to know Ginger because I thought he was a fantastic drummer, and I'd seen him play with Graham Bond, and interviewed him for the MM. And one day he rang me up and said, "I'm leaving Graham Bond, and I'm forming a band." I said, "Oh, right, what is it?" 3-piece, and we've got Eric on guitar and Jack on bass. "Oh, wow, that's terrific. What are you going to call it?" And he said, "Oh, it's going to be called Cream." And he said, "Do you want to come down and see us rehearsing?" So I ran a short story about this new group being formed, super group, I called them, because they were pretty incredible. And all the managers rang up the next day, or when the paper came out, and said, "What are you talking about? They're all signed to us. Eric Clapton's playing with John Mayall, Ginger Baker's with Graham Bond, and Jack Bruce's with Manfred Mann." And all the managers were furious because nobody bothered to tell them that their star players were leaving. So anyway, Robert Stigwood came on the scene, signed them up, and he told me, "Don't worry about it." So they were threatening to sue, actually.
Wow.
threatening me and printing all these lies. And he said, no, it's all true. And he issued a press release. And I went down to see them playing their first rehearsal in this funny old dusty hall. And they started playing. They didn't have much gear. Just Ginger had about 3 drums, I think, just a heap of an old drum kit in the corner. And they were making mistakes. I remember Eric and Jack saying, you made a mistake. You effed that up. And arguing already. They'd only played 3 numbers. It all began there. And so Robert Stigwood was looking very alarmed. He just invested money in them. He was managing the Bee Gees, of course, but he'd just taken on this band. He came over and whispered in my ear. He said, are they any good? And I thought, I was quite flattered, really, to be asked. And I thought years later, if I said, no, they're a load of rubbish, I could have destroyed their career there and then. There wouldn't have been any cream. But I said, no, they're brilliant. Don't worry. No, they're really good. Great. And so that's really what I think started progressive rock that we were talking about, because of the interest in expanding. And the Yardbirds, for example, were playing difficult, interesting arrangements for your love. So it already started. And then there was the underground happened when everything went berserk. LSD and nightclubs like Middle Earth, and which I used to go to, and UFO in Tottenham Court Road. You'd see all these marvellous, interesting, fascinating new groups. Pink Floyd I saw, and the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Let me think, who else was there coming up at that time? There were all these whole new bands coming on the scene. And the Jimi Hendrix Experience, that was another experience. So combined with this new musicianship, the great players, the fantastic guitar players, allowed to play and make albums. And then that developed further. The next wave was progressive rock. And that led to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis and King Crimson. And that was the start. And I actually called it progressive rock because I'd like progressive jazz. And I thought, this is what these guys want to do. You know, they want to use their fantastic technique and their new ideas and imagination. All the nice, of course. Forgot them.
Yeah.
So,
Brilliant.
it was a very exciting time, and I encouraged it as much as I could, writing about all those bands. And the nice thing about writing about progressive rock, it wasn't ignored. The public took to it immediately. It was tailor-made for albums. The great classic concept album, and the space to play what the hell you liked, take risks, and not be told by the producer or the record company what you're supposed to be doing. No record company would have told Emerson, Lake and Palmer what to play.
Was it true that ELP he had like a brass drum kit or something that weighed like 2 tons? And they had
it wasn't brass. No, it was it was
steel or something, or
chromium. I think it was that stainless steel. Stainless steel.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, because Carl was very competitive. That's the thing about ELP. They were all great musicians. They'd all been in, like, Greg was in King Crimson. Keith Emerson was in The Nice, which was a terrific band I used to go and see a lot and write about. And Carl, of course, had been originally with Chris Farlow and the Thunderbirds when he was 16.
Wow.
I need to learn from jazz drummers. He was a huge jazz fan.
Yeah.
And then he was playing with the Atomic Rooster. And then I knew Atomic Rooster, of course, with Vincent Crane. And all together, once they all got together, they were all very competitive because they all wanted to experiment. So Keith would have wanted to play a battery of keyboards, which rode his night then. You know, not just a hammered organ anymore, which he'd been pushing around the stage on caster wheels, apparently, with the Nice. And of course, he wanted to experiment with synthesizers and huge organ keyboard setups, playing classical music, rock music, all mixed together, rock and roll and jazz. And then Greg, of course, was the middleman with a wonderful voice, playing fantastic bass guitar and other guitar as well, acoustic and lead guitar. And that's what made the band so extraordinary. And then Carl came along with his drum kit, and he was faced with this competition from these guys, all writing and creating this wonderful music. And he wanted to show what a great drummer he was, which he was, of course. Great, studied percussion. And then had this, it became very, very much a show band, as you know, the Emerson, Lake and Palmer pioneered showmanship on stage. And, I saw at the Isle of Wight in 1970, their first show.
Wow, you were there, were you?
Yeah, I
You
was
were
in
all
the
right.
front row. Yeah.
Amazing.
I filmed it on my cine camera. And
Wow, that must be worth a fortune.
they didn't, it's silent, of course, unfortunately. No sound.
Oh, yeah.
But I was sitting in the front row and they did this terrific set. I'd seen them rehearse. I've been to a rehearsal. I went to the first rehearsal and Carl was told that he'd got to learn how to play 21st Century Schizoid Man by King Crimson, because Greg was keen on playing that. And it's a very difficult piece to play, especially for a drummer. And I saw him rehearsing it and he was dripping in sweat. He said, "Oh, God, that was hard, that was tough." And as it turned out, they never played it, the band.
Amazing.
On stage at the Isle of Wight, they came on at the right time, and people say, "Oh, well, the public weren't into progressive rock." Actually, they were very much so. They went down an absolute storm,
Yeah.
and the material from their first album, and of course they climaxed the show. They had two big brass cannons on either side that they bought from a hardware shop. No, it was an antique shop in Chelsea, Kings Road. The roadies had stuffed them with flash powder, which you're not supposed to do, and put something inside it, and they touched them off at the climax of the last number. I think it was Rondo. The real big climax, the last number, and they touched them at the little ports. They weren't supposed to be used as cannons at all. They were ornate. And there was a tremendous bang, and showers of smoke and flame shooting out the cannon. It wasn't firing a cannonball, mercifully, just an explosion. But unfortunately, an Italian photographer gate crashed the stage and wanted close-up pictures, paparazzi, and he was standing right next to the cannon, and it blew him across the stage and landed on his backside, I think. So that was the dramatic intro for ELP, and of course the audience went berserk, they were all cheering, and that's from that, as Greg Lake said later, one night they were unknown, next day they were world famous. So, a lot of truth in that.
Can we just touch on, if it's all right, like, he's the drummer's drummer, isn't he? John Bonham. Can we talk about John Bonham for a second?
John Bonham was a wonderful drummer, yeah, and different style. That's the nice thing about all the rock drummers in that period, with all the bands, they all played in their own style and sound. Like Keith Moon was a great drummer. Nobody else played like Keith Moon, as he said himself. I'm the best Keith Moon drummer in the world, so entirely true. Tony Williams, Miles Davis' drummer, I asked him once, well, who's his favourite drummer? He said, Keith Moon. Surprising, wasn't it? Because he played free. And John Bonham, I first saw playing with Led Zeppelin, then called, it was still called the New Yardbirds at the Marquee. And I'd heard all about, Jimmy Page had told me about this new band he was forming. He came into the office. Can you imagine that? They all came up to see me in the office to tell me about their new bands after Cream and Hendrix Experience. Now it was Led Zeppelin. And I said, "What's the name of the band?" And he said, "It's called Led Zeppelin." And I wrote it down in my notebook. He said, "No, you spelled it wrong. It's L-E-D, not L-E-A-D." So Jimmy told me off immediately. And he said, "Well, we're playing at the Marquee." So I went to see them at the Marquee. And I was standing next to Marc, from the drummer from Rare Bird. Remember him? Young drummer from Rare Bird. Mark Ashton. And we watched John Bonham play for the first time, and he was so powerful and exciting and driving. And Mark said, he's unbelievable. He said, "I'm giving up." And he said, at that point, he stopped playing the drums. I can't play the drums after seeing John Bonham.
It's interesting that Hendrix and Bonham probably made more musicians quit than start.
Yeah.
I think it's...
Well, one story that John told me later when I got to know him, became good friends, actually. He was a really nice guy, fantastic drummer. And I went on tour with Zeppelin, mercifully, because I'd given him some good reviews, and Peter Grant was very pleased the way I wrote about the band. So it wasn't planned, it just happened that way. And I got to know John. He told me when he first started playing in Birmingham, in the Midlands, and he'd go into a studio and start hammering away really loud. And the engineer would say, "You can't play like that in the studio, you'll destroy the microphones. There's no future in playing drums like that. You're going the wrong way about it." This
young man.
He was banned from the studio, banned from lots of pubs, and used to wreck other people's drum kits. He had a habit of going into a pub and seeing a band play, say, "Oh, can I sit in, mate?" And in a Birmingham accent, not Cockney accent. And they say reluctantly, "Oh, okay." And he'd hammer away on the drum kit and leave a wreckage pile of the snare drum gone, head gone, bass drum on the floor, falling over. And so he was banned from lots of pubs from playing. And he told me that years later, when he had a load of gold albums and silver platinum albums, he went to see this drum teacher who told him there was no future in playing loud. And he said, "Here you are, this is the future of playing loud." Platinum Led Zeppelin album.
Brilliant.
So that was his revenge. But no, he was a fantastic drummer. And I was very fortunate to be on stage with Led Zeppelin and watch him playing close up. Yeah.
That's amazing. So you've had the British invasion, then you had the prog rock of the 70s, and then in the 80s you joined Kerrang! So you had the new wave of British metal as well.
Brilliant.
What was it like to go from prog rock to metal? Was it an easy transition for you to get to, or was it kind of you had to get used to the rock kind of side of stuff that's heavier than...
Yes, it was difficult at first. I did have to get used to it. I felt I knew about the first wave of heavy metal, because when I was on Melody Maker, bands like Iron Maiden were just coming in, and then I left the MM mainly because of... I'd been there for 15 or 16 years, and it was wonderful. But I thought, I've got to do something else. I can't just stay on Melody Maker the rest of my life and be writing about Genesis when all the other kids are writing about something in rap music or something grunge or something totally new. You realise there's a point where maybe you should move on. Because, as I say, when I joined Melody Maker, there were people who've been there since 1936. Writing about British dance fans, so I didn't really want to be in that situation. And I was offered a job on a new paper called Musicians Only, and that's a nice thing to be assistant editor. And we had our own office in Charing Cross Road, and that was great fun. But sadly, there was a journalist strike, and the paper was off the streets for several weeks and months while the unions and the empires were sorting out a pay deal. And of course, when they came back, the circulation had vanished. The paper had disappeared from the stands, and they closed the paper. So I was then made redundant, which was no fun at all, apart from getting a redundancy payment. And I sat around thinking, what the hell am I going to do now? The Melody Maker didn't want me back, by the way, which I thought they might, but they didn't, because they were moving on into pastures new. By the way, I got a great exclusive story with the Rolling Stones.
Okay.
I became freelance for a while, freelancing.
Yeah.
Because I knew the Stones, and they invited me to America to see them preparing for a tour. And it was in Boston. And I went to the secret venue where they were rehearsing. And with Bill and Keith and Nick, Charlie. And who else was there? Yeah, that's a lot. Oh, Ronnie Wood.
Ronnie, yeah.
Yeah. And I had exclusive access to the Stones before they did a big show in New York. And they invited me upstairs, and they played some numbers for me. I was sitting on the floor listening to the Rolling Stones.
Wow.
An audience of one. I thought, what a fantastic story. This is great. And I rang the Melody Maker when I got back, said, I've got this great scoop. I had a Melody Maker. Nobody else was allowed to see them rehearsing. And the editor, who was sure remain nameless, said, "Oh no, we want somebody from our office to do it. We don't want you." I thought, oh, thank you. 15 years of work on Melody Maker. That was their attitude. They were resentful because I'd got it and one of their staff hadn't. So I offered it to Record Mirror, their rival, and they ran it. But that's the perils of being a freelance. And after that, while I was on Musicians Only, I'd written about Iron Maiden, who I really liked. I thought a great young British hard rock band. And as it turned out, I got to know them. Well, Steve, their later drummer, Nico McBrain. And it turned out, would you believe, progressive rock by this time, we're talking about late 70s, early 80s, it was a death sentence. I think that's why the MM didn't want me anymore. They associated me with Genesis, and the ELP, and they were persona non grata, and you just didn't write about them anymore. It's like punk rock or else. So Yeah, I wrote about Iron Maiden, and I went to see them. They're really nice guys. And would you believe it? Guess what music they liked? Jethro Tull.
Awesome.
You get more prog rock than that. Oh, the other funny thing was I interviewed. I did try and write about punk rock. Actually, I did Generation X. I liked them. I thought they were a great band, and I liked Billy Idol. I interviewed him,
Yeah.
and I thought they were a great band, very exciting. And yeah, what was that leading to? Oh, yes, that's right. There was a punk rock magazine called Sniffing Glue. I don't know if you remember that.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Sniffing Glue. So, and he was running the first kind of fanzine for punk. So I, as a fellow journalist, I had to write about Sex Pistols, who I went to see and reviewed as well, live. And I interviewed Mark of Sniffing Glue, the ultimate voice of punk rock. I was doing a picture on him. And I said, well, what bands did you like? And he said, oh, I love Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So the secret was revealed. All these punk people were all secret prog rock bands.
Amazing.
But I turn up for the books. I'm barred from writing about music on the MM. And all these guys are actually progressive rock fans secretly. Oh, that's the other funny thing.
Okay.
Johnny Rotten became a great friend with Keith Emerson. So that's the ultimate irony.
Over the years, should we say 60-year music career of journalism, is there an artist that came out that you really thought was going to do well but actually just didn't and just faded into obscurity, like an album or a band that you thought, this is brilliant and this is the future?
That's a very good question, actually. Yeah, there were musicians I did try and encourage and didn't always make it. Most of them did, I have to say. Like Genesis, who I went to see when they first played in a little... I saw Genesis playing upstairs at Ronnie Scott's club. You know, the small room upstairs, and promotional gig. And the first time I'd seen them, I was with Peter Frampton, actually. Peter and I were having a drink in La Chasse, and we said, let's go down to Ronnie's and see who's playing upstairs. Upstairs at Ronnie's was a venue. And there was this strange band playing there, with a bloke standing with a bass drum, standing up and singing with a bass drum. And we discovered they were Genesis. They were called Genesis. That's the first time we saw them. They were very successful. So I can't say that they were failures. Most of the people I saw did turn out to be huge successes. Often like Mark Bolan, of course.
I love Mark.
We haven't talked about Mark, but anyway, that's another time. I did like Peter Banks, the guitar player was Yes. I thought he was a great guitar player. He was on the first Yes album, 2 Yes albums. And unfortunately, he was let go by the band. Often musicians tend to make a fatal error. Drummers, lead guitar players, they try and walk before... they want to be stars too soon.
Yeah.
They want to be individuals. They want to have the limelight on them too much, you know. And that offends the two guys in the background who are actually writing the songs. And they're really the stars of the band, and they run the band. So I've known this happen to sort of other friends' bands who aren't famous at all, but that does happen. The worst thing a drummer can do, by the way, is to put lights in your bass drum or have a drum riser built by your dad. So immediately you do that, you get fired by the lead guitar player. So Peter, who's a great guitar player, I thought, on those first two albums, and had a unique sound. And one of his fans was actually Pete Townsend. Townsend thought he was a good guitar player. But he tried too hard. He was throwing the guitar up in the air and catching it. And I remember Chris and John of Yes calling me one day and said, well, you're friends with Peter. Can you tell him just to shorten the solo? It's going on for 15 minutes. You know? And this is like a band that's still making its way. It hasn't had any hits yet. And you can't really overdo it that much. So Peter made a mistake, tried to be the star too soon, and was let go. And he did form his own band Flash later, which was very good, I thought. But it was a downward spiral after that. So he never really was fully appreciated. I thought he was a great guitar player, and he should have done. And I did try and help him as much as I could. So, yeah, that's the story. One musician I thought should have done really well, but didn't quite make it.
Can we just briefly talk about Mark now we've brought him up? Like, I just think he was probably one of the best. I still feel underrated artists. Like, people just sort of say, you know, big curly hair, Lamb voice. But he wrote some of the most amazing songs in the 70s, I think, especially Hot Love.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, well, Mark, I always thought had tremendous potential. Like such a funny guy, and I first met him in the corridor at Melody Maker office. He come up to. He's a very great self-publicist. I was saying like drummers shouldn't put lights in their bass drums or try and promote themselves too much, but Mark knew all about self-promotion, and he was so charming and funny and articulate, and but totally ignored mostly by the record companies and the music business. People quite disparaging about him. I remember publicists for other artists saying, "Oh, Mark Bolan, soppy kid," he's like, they didn't take him seriously at all. This curly haired, cheeky kid, and who thought he was a star, and he was a star. He was born to be a star, really, wasn't he? And I first saw him running down the corridor in the IPC office in Fleet Street, and he was heading for Disc, which was her sister paper. And he wanted to see Penny Valentine, who's a wonderful jazz and a great pop writer. And he was going for an interview, and I just sort of made a joke about him. I said, "Oh, you look like Pansy Potter, the strong man's daughter." I don't know if you remember the character in Bandy and Beano's. It's a long while ago now. He looked like a cartoon character, I remember, with big hair, big frizzy. So he turned around and looked at me, and they laughed. And after that, we became friends. Came to see me instead of Penny.
Amazing.
But the first time I actually was aware of him, I reviewed his single he did. I'm just looking it up, actually. My book of 1,000 words here. It was his first. It's The Wizard. That's right. I'd forgotten that.
Wow.
1965. I heard this single called The Wizard, which was on Decca when Mark was doing solo singles. And I liked it. I thought it was really interesting and great record. So, and then after that, he joined John's Children, which was Simon Napier Bell's band, rival to The Who, or tried to be, I think. And they were on Track Records. Notorious for terrible, violent stage shows. And I interviewed John's Children in our local pub, the Red Lion, which is where I did all my interviews in the Red Lion. And Mark Bolan and with John's Children, we all sat at the table. Mark didn't drink then, by the way.
Right.
Didn't like beer. Nor did Mick Jagger. He hated drinking. He said, "I can't imagine myself drinking a pint of anything, let alone beer," he said to me. But Mark was, remember I told you that Eric Clapton always looked slightly out of place in the Yardbirds? He had that little "I'm not with them" atmosphere vibe. And the same with Mark sitting with John's Children. They're all very up and loud, boisterous. And Mark was sitting there quietly looking a bit glum and fed up. And I discovered why. It was because they weren't playing his songs. He'd written all his songs. He wanted to be the songwriter. Even then, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wasn't going to stay with John's Children, although they got a record deal and were making records in the papers. And they'd done that Desdemona, which I think Mark actually wrote, actually. Yes, he did write that. So, but he wanted more songs being covered by the group. He wasn't happy with John's Children. And then next time I saw him, he came back to the pub and turned up with a manager guy. And he said, I've left John's Children. I'm forming my own group. I said, "Hey, what's it going to be called? Is it a big group? And you got drummers and things?" He said, "No, it's just two of us." "Two of you?" "Yeah." He said, "It's going to be the biggest band in the world." I said, "Well, how is that?" He said, "It's called Tyrannosaurus Rex." So although it's a small group, it's big on ambition. And you got the gear together, dates and things. They're going to play at the, what's that place in Covent Garden? Yes. Middle Earth, places like that. And he says, "Yeah, we got all the gear together. We've been to Woolworths. We bought it all in Woolworths." "Well, what did you buy at Woolworths?" He said, a toy drum kit and a Bon Tempi electric keyboard. And that's the cheapest organ you can buy in the world. It sounded terrible, but it's about 20 quid in Woolworths, I think. So, and bongos. I went to see the rehearsing at Mark's. Lived in a tiny little flat in Notting Hill Gate on the top floor. And he had this one-room flat with his girlfriend, June. And I went up there for dinner with June and Mark. And he said, "Do you want to see my studio?" I said, Yeah. And he pulled a curtain aside, and there's a little cubicle, and it's called Toadstool Studio. And that's where he wrote all his songs and played acoustic guitar. And it was like the size of a telephone box. He had his own studio. He said, "Do you want to play the bongos?" I said, "Yeah, okay." So I played the bongos on Deborah, Westman. Not on the final record, but I played with Mark when he was rehearsing Deborah. So I could have been on the record.
That's good enough for me.
Skin bongos, yeah. Deborah.
Music journalism was obviously quite a thing in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and it was quite a sort of target for people to go to get an opinion. Do you think it's as important today as it was back in the day?
Probably not. No, I think it's all down to the internet now, isn't it? People have access to everything, music, and all bands have their own websites now, and you find out when so-and-so was born, or when they were married, or what was their first album. It's all available. Vast, massive information, which we used to glean from, if we were lucky, a printed EMI press release, typewritten one page. What's Bo Diddley's life? You get a handout sent round by a motorcycle messenger some days later. So it's all very slow and primitive. And I was on the music paper, the weeklies. But we did it, There was a big team, vast team of people producing that weekly. Now you can all sit at home like we're doing now, and I could go on my other computer and look up Wikipedia or Spotify and find out stuff. I was looking up my first favourite records. They're all on Spotify. So instead of waiting for a motorbike messenger to deliver the latest Beatles album and play it once, twice, and then wait for a press release, and then make long phone calls. No tape recorder, by the way. Didn't have a tape recorder.
Right.
Everything was scribbly notes, ink. You were covered in ink, basically, waiting for a motorbike messenger. But now, of course, it's totally changed. And I'm not sure. I mean, there are still some great music publications. Mojo, I think, is still happening. I've written for Mojo. And Record Collector is a great magazine. That's a real specialist magazine. I've written for them too. There were specialist magazines like Rhythm, the drummers magazine, sadly no longer. And it was the one I did like was, there's a few that I've been writing for have gone. They've all disappeared.
Yeah, Q's gone as well,
Yeah. Yeah. It shows you how soon you forget. It's terrible, isn't it? You can't even remember the names of the magazines I used to write for every week.
Because there's so many.
Yeah.
You've written many wonderful books. Your John Bonham book's great as well, and your Viv Stanshaw book is great as well. If people want to get those books and find out more about you, where's the best place to go?
I do have that. I think I'm on Wikipedia, actually, and I have got my own website. It's called Chris Welsh Online. That's .com. So you can find them there. And let me see. Well, there's the publishers, of course, like the Keith Emerson book. It has I can tell you who they're published by. Rocket 88 is the publisher. But she sounds like the very first rock and roll record, doesn't it? Rocket 88. It does,
yeah.
So that was published last November, around about my birthday, actually. That was the last book I did. And that was exhausting work, very tiring, very intense, very emotional. So.
I'll put a link to your website in the description so people can find it. Chris, it's been amazing talking to you today. I could do it for hours, to be honest with you.
I better stop talking, Robbie, yeah. And another thing. No.